indirectly. And we might also have a nice diagram that shows a strike-slip fault like the San Andreas, again with block diagrams with sections. And why stop there? Why not show the entire Earth? And so I love this diagram where we've got kind of a section of the Earth cut out and showing mantle, outer core, inner core, and then things expanded to show more detail. I mentioned before that geology is really concerned with time and history. And so the other thing we use these for is to show a sequence or a developmental history of a structure. So I was talking about unconformities. So we might have an early history of deposition with these layers, and then the crust is shortened. And to accommodate that shortening, there's a little bit of folding. And then erosion takes over, and it bevels that surface. And then that whole part of the crust is submerged again, and we get more deposition on top of it. And this is this unconformity. So that's the historical sequence of how an unconformity develops. And the reason it's important is that it shows that a lot of time is required to develop these structures. And again, we might have a sequence showing how faults develop, and then erosion changes the landscape and creates these offset marker beds. And there's a famous mountain in Montana called Chief Mountain. So here's like where the fault's going to develop, and we show a couple of stages, and then there's erosion, and we get this little isolated remnant. Have any of you ever hiked up Mount Greylock in Williamstown in Western Mass? Mount Greylock is a lot like this. It was part of a much bigger thrust sheet that has been completely eroded by and isolated. So it's a little clip up. And again, here's like a sequence showing how we might go from continents. So of course the Atlantic is only 180 million years old. And actually most of it is only 150 million years old. Compared with the age of the Earth, which is over 4.5 billion, it's a rather young feature. So there was a big continent, Pangaea, at the end of the Paleozoic, and then it starts to rift, and we develop these rift valleys, not unlike the African rift valley today. But then we get a linear sea like the Red Sea, and then we end up with a full-blown ocean like the Atlantic. So 4.5 billion years of Earth history to explore, right? Geologists, I jokingly compare this to like colonial Europe, you know, creating countries in Africa that have absolutely no meaning whatsoever, and in other parts of the world. So we take all of geologic time and we just kind of chunk it up into different time periods. Some of them actually make sense. So there's a massive great extinction at the end of the Permian, right? And so having the Paleozoic, which is this area down here, separated from the Mesozoic here makes sense. And then there's a second big extinction right here at the Cretaceous. So this is when the dinosaurs come to their age, their dominance of Earth comes to an end. And then we go into the Cenozoic, or the modern life period. But actually, there were really big mass extinctions in the Ordovician and the Devonian, right in the middle of these. So these don't all make sense. Like some of them do, but many of them do not. But they developed over time. So we're constantly trying to develop a history of the Earth. And part of what we do, so this is where my work comes in, I do geochronology. I can do precise dating of igneous rocks. But there are lots of rocks that don't lend themselves to precise dating. So we rely on this thing called cross-cutting relationships. So imagine, let's go back to the castle analogy. So what if Kenilworth Castle is a bit unusual because it was actually kind of built in one go in the 1100s. But lots of castles were built Like my old Vermont farmhouse that I happily sold many decades ago, a lot of castles were built in stages, right? So you might go and look at the remnants of this and try to figure out which part was built first and which part was built second. And you're looking for cross-cutting relationships. That's what you would actually be doing. And that's exactly what we do. So I would, again, rely on a symbolic section like this and say, okay, the first thing that happened here, and I'm just going to run through these quickly because of time. But A is some sedimentary rock that's metamorphosed and deformed, and we make these little squiggles to show that it's, you know, it's like a schist or something. And then we have an intrusion, which is B. So some igneous body comes in. Then there's a period of erosion, and then C and D are deposited on top of it. So I look at this and just like kind of instantly, that's it, right? Like, because I've been thinking about this for so long, it takes me no time. But it's a nice way to introduce my students to thinking about things like this. So here's some sedimentary layers, A, B, C. They're faulted. There's a period of erosion, and then E is deposited on top. So these are simple enough that we can look at them and get the concept of cross-cutting relationship.
Oh, could you go by one more?
Sure.
I just wonder if there's any chance at all B could be before A.
Okay. And
Huh?
and what would be the?
No, I mean, could it be by any chance the order of like, B first, then A, and C and D?
Well, so let's say that this is a granite.
Right.
So you know, or some sort of igneous rock.
okay.
Most of them crystallize
Yeah.
in the subsurface,
Mhm.
but also, like it needs something to contain it.
Sure. So you need to have also what kind of rock it is to really see the
That's
order
right.
of the.
That's
okay,
right.
that's
I mean, it could be a volcano
Right.
with sediments deposited on the sides, right?
Yeah.
But then.
Because this is exactly what I had maybe for my high school geoscience exam. Write the order of the strata.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great.
And then we get into these more complicated diagrams, right? And so you can kind of work through there are a couple of faults of different ages and some sills and some dikes of different ages. And you can work through the history. And this is the kind of thing that I might give my students, my more advanced students, on a quiz, a diagram like this. And they have to figure out what's the oldest feature in this cross-section and work their way to the youngest.
I
Right.
love that.
You have this?
I love that.
Oh, I know. I love that. Thank you.
So we should
Thank you.
We should ask that to the landscape architecture students before entering to them.
You know, admission fees?
So okay, I will tell. This is
Okay,
a very.
let's do
This is the best predictor of how well students will do in my class.
Exactly.
Right here.
Oh, in my class too.
This is it. All I have to do is give them this question, see how they do, and I will tell you what their final grade will be. Every time. It's
I
amazing.
have a question. Do you think that this should be taught at the? I'm not from this country. I'm from Spain. I was surprised how my students here they didn't know anything about rocks. In Spain,
It's sad.
we learned that in middle school, in
There-
geography.
there-
Everybody.
It varies widely state by state and school district by school
Okay.
district. I had some geology in middle school and it was an awful class and probably put me off to geology for many years. It should be part of every high school curriculum.
I think
Just
so.
basic information about the
Basic.
environment and geology.
Where do you live? It's the beginning of everything.
Yes, I agree. You don't have to convince me.
Excuse me, is it A, B, C, D, E is a randomly allocated or just the ordinary like youngest?
No, I don't.
You know what I mean? A in the bottom, the B is kind of up. So is it?
No,
This
this
is
is
for
a
quiz.
quiz.
That's the okay, yeah, that's it.
Yes, yes.
I was so confused. Why the B is there?
Yes, exactly, right? So these things aren't always,
Okay.
so actually A forms pretty late in the game because all of these other things have
Before,
to,
yeah.
because so the cross-cutting part of it is, we can see that this is probably like say a granite or something. And it's all very abstract and stuff, but it has to be older than this unconformity.
Right, right.
but it has to be younger than this layer and this layer and everything that it intrudes. And so then here's actually an interesting little thing. So there's this fault, and we don't see it in contact with A, right? So it's not a direct thing, but we see, this is an unconformity right here. We see that the fault has to be older than the unconformity, but we see that the unconformity has to be older than the granite, right? So you can actually, it's unambiguous. When I give my students ambiguous cross-sections, it drives them completely crazy. And that's what we deal with all the time. So now I've worked my way through like real sections and synthetic sections and symbolic sections. And I want to get to what like geologists really do, which is interpretive sections. And this is a geologic map of Grand Canyon. And think a little bit about this. So this is a detail. And so these colors on the map, these represent different recognizable geologic formations, right? So they're things that, like, you might not recognize them the first time you looked at them, but if you read my description of these layers, then you would be able to go and recognize and distinguish this from adjacent units. And then the other thing that's really interesting is geologists just end up, and this is again something I'm sure Tim would have talked about or thinks about. We look at this map, and I can just tell you with dead certainty that all of these geologic formations are almost horizontal, because the boundaries between them are nearly parallel to these topographic contours. So they have to be roughly horizontal. You might have noticed that I never actually say any color because I have a color vision deficiency, and I'm pretty sure that no matter what I say it will be wrong. And I can kind of see the different tones and stuff in here, but like the names always elude me. So the first geologic map, it was made in 1815. William Smith, a map of England. Smith was not a geologist, he was an engineer. And so this is when England is starting to become industrialized, and they have this huge, huge effort to build these canals through lots of England for basically transporting stuff from one place to another. And Smith was an engineer who helped build these canals and did engineering things, but he also got really interested in the rocks that they were making cross sections through. So instead of road cuts, they were making canal cuts, right? And he started collecting rocks, and he used fossils, and people had already recognized that fossils were restricted to certain layers, and they had started building a geologic timescale. So he made this map through, like, as a byproduct of his work on canals. So this is what a modern geologic map looks like from Arizona. Nicely colored. So here's the map. Here are two cross sections through the map. They're running roughly west to east. Here's one of the sections. And then it's too small to read, but it doesn't matter. This is the geologic column. So these different colors have short descriptions that tell you what the formation is. So geologists, a good geologist, can look at this map and tell you a lot about the overall configuration of the rocks just by glancing at the map. From the patterns, and then you could also refer to these cross sections and get a lot more detail. Okay, and here's another geologic map, Bryce Canyon. So I could look at this, and these are all very young deposits along streams. This dendritic pattern is a classic stream deposit. And so it's again telling me that these layers are roughly flat-lying. And we have cross-sections here. There's some faults that go through them. And this is a great big long stratigraphic column. Again, another section, a vertical section that shows the relative age of the rocks. And then if you've ever been to Arches, this is National Park. This is a terrific map and cross-section and a great place to go. And most of the rocks are pretty flat lying here. There's a big fault over here. This red, it's red enough that I can see that it's red. It's actually a big salt diapier, and the arches all formed above this salt diapier when it deformed the crust above and rose up.
Oh, could you show us where the section?
Oh yes, of course. It starts here, so this is A,
Oh, okay.
and it runs all the way
I
up
see.
to here. Thank you for asking. And again, we've got a nice column that shows the age and relative order of the rocks, and then a little bit more detail about them. And it's a beautiful, beautiful map. I will say, and I have to actually, I'm not trying to sound like snobby, but this is inevitably going to sound snobby. So, like Tim might talk about geologists and lump geologists into a group, right? But like honestly, that's not quite right. So there are structural geologists, right? And there are people who like live and breathe this sort of stuff. And we can look at these maps, and I can look at this cross section and combine it with this map and see what's going on in the subsurface. Most geologists cannot. Not only cannot most people, most geologists cannot. And so I think that structural geologists become structural geologists because we're the people who took that class who liked doing it.
I have a question. Without the section, you would have much less information.
That's
section,
right, absolutely.
It's super critical.
The section is absolutely critical.
And where they cut the section, why they cut there or not like that?
They're trying to maximize the information that can be shown in one section.
So, and from this section, you can imagine what's going on in that direction and in that direction. So,
that's right. And what you're also trying to do is take information from the whole map and project it into this one section.
Okay.
So it's not as if you could do a traverse and walk across this line and then get all the information. You're taking information from both directions and projecting it into that section. That's a really good question.
Question. Oh, actually, for Teresa's last semester option studio, we were looking at French geology map similar to this. Is there an international convention for colors and the codes that go into?
Oh, if only that were the case.
No, right? I do realize that there's some similarities, but
I think that every country sort of has its own. The U.S. Geological Survey has a very strict, like you must do it this way. For any publication that comes out of there, and they're sensible, mostly. Every now and then they fail miserably because sometimes you want like colors, especially for people like me who have color vision deficiencies. You want colors that really contrast to show critical relationships, and if you follow their guidelines, sometimes you end up with like a bunch of dull colors that hide what's important about the map. Okay, so again, we think about the beautiful vista of the Grand Canyon from the South Rim and all of the good geology that you can see. And then we want to convey this information to people who, this is actually a commercial product. And so there's a beautiful cross section that's kind of like a block diagram. It's a little bit funky scale, right? So lots of vertical exaggeration. They have a lot of geography drawn on the top surface. But it's really wonderful because it's showing a lot of what's going on in Utah and Arizona. So we start way up in, so here's Bryce Canyon and Cedar Breaks. And it goes south. We can see a nice fault here. There's some intrusive body with little sills branching off. We see, this is what's called the Great Unconformity. So it's Cambrian on top of old Precambrian rocks. This is that Unkar group that I was talking about. Here's Grand Canyon. And then there's a southern half. And again, what's really interesting is it's symbolic, but it's also incorporating real data, right? So So very stylized. These are San Francisco peaks down near Flagstaff, and we have some big magma body down here, eruptions, dikes, Grand Canyon. So it's I think a very user-friendly way of encapsulating an enormous amount of information and getting the big picture. So scale is really critical, and what you can show at one scale is impossible to show at another scale. And again, this is a great, this is actually from a textbook, and it's showing Colorado River. And what I like about this is it's bringing in time. So we've got time over here. We've got the different units, the main units that you see in the Grand Canyon. But it also helps visualize the way that these things are actually manifest in the topography. So out west, anything that's a shale forms very shallow slopes. And sandstones and limestones form steep cliffs. So it's a great way of summarizing all of that. We also, again, this whole time thing, we use cross sections, and then it's a combination of a test to see if the cross section makes sense. You should be able to undeform everything. So we actually reconstruct, and this is like, if you can do this well, the oil companies will pay you any amount of money to come work for them, right? Because this is how oil and gas is actually prospected. So you make a cross section, and then to test whether it's viable, you undeform it, and you come up with a past history, and it also helps you then target exploration sites. So it has a it's not just like a teaching tool, it's a very practical tool. I love this. Honestly, poor color vision deficient Paul loves this. Because, so this actually gets back to your question about color coding. So these are sort of international colors that are used for different ages of rocks. And I look at this map. I actually have it on my computer, a super high resolution version of it. And it's beautiful. You can really zoom in. But if you look at this, okay, so Tim, I'm sure, he talked about chunking, right? Maybe chunking? Maybe not. Tim loves the concept of chunking. So I look at this map, and I see chunks of the United States. So I'll show you some. So there's this kind of stuff out here, right? These are the youngest sediments. They're not even rocks yet. This gray is like Mississippi mud, right? And then there are these bright colors out here. These are called the coastal plain deposits. So these are things that are fairly young. But then look at so obviously these are the Appalachians running up through here. But what happens right down here? All of this stuff, this darker stuff, gets truncated. So these rocks have to be older, and they're cross-cut by these younger sediments. So this is a big angular unconformity. This little dome feature up here, this is the Adirondacks. If you've ever gone hiking, they're very old rocks. We've got the mid-continent. These are honestly, like if you're a paleontologist and you study fossils, they're wonderful rocks. If you're me, they're like